a bit of a nice milestone with law of implication, right? We're making this so it can be on YouTube, and I'll take a look at Truth Social as well. Rumble was a little bit hard to use, and like the format and stuff early on when I started this stuff. I don't want to cut off my nose to spite my face by just ignoring YouTube. But anyway, pretty awesome. You know, I've talked about this topic in the past a couple times, but I think people are looking forward to hearing it this time, and it'll be kind of, you know, some new stuff as well from what I've said before, but the answer is still the same. And here we are with the world on the brink of nuclear war, and so nice to, but the news about God is actually really great. It couldn't really be better, like the truth about existence and how it works and what we can know. So that's good, at least, but yeah. So I'm a bit fired up because of the situation in the world. And you know, like for people that you know, I talk about politics too, for anyone that's kind of new to this or newly seeing it in the future. And for people that say, oh, why do you have to talk about politics? Like most people don't say that, but some people do, of course. You know, but when politics stops coming to me, you know, I'll be happy to ignore it. But when it starts ignoring me, you know, but until then, it matters. It matters for people to have their ideas straight. Like it isn't that I'm ever, or it isn't that I have a plan on what to do about things, but except for, to start with, what I know is that having our ideas right regarding, of course, individual property rights, but then politics in general, or foundationally having some sense of what we know, it matters, and that's a great place to start, at least. And so that's a very relevant. And all these things, you know, they tie together. All right, so thrilled to be here as always. Maybe the last time I came here live for a while. Oh, well, I will miss you, Julian. Hope to have you back. But recordings are great too, especially with our bit of a YouTube push. Although I haven't begun like a particular YouTube push. I'm, you know, kind of focused on making certain webinars. By the way, so I think we can, weirdly enough, it's kind of, I realized this kind of all of a sudden, but the definitive series can be thought of as finished. It ties in very nicely if people start with the definitive series, then the law of implication explained that I actually chronologically did first. So that really comes in kind of nicely after that. And then there's the wonderful Heroes series with talking to people, talking to you guys, and that was great. And that's a nice thing, kind of interspersed or whenever people want to look at that. And it kind of humanizes things, and you know, just in every way, it's nice. Now I think what I'll do for some amount of time is to go topic by topic. And of course, the topic today is about how to know about the truth about God and the nature of God and so forth. Now, here I'll go to slides. So I'm going to take as long as it takes. It's not like I'm going to say, you know, I'll do this for an hour and a half and then magically be done. We may be done in an hour and a half, and it may take multiple webinars and so forth. So because when it comes to this topic, and when it comes to what ties into this topic and is necessary as a foundation for knowing how to know God's existence, is what? We have to know how to know things in the first place. Which people don't, right? And everything's absurd. Everything is nonsense and stupidity. Any decision that we make, actions we take, responses we have to other people, beliefs we profess to have, it's all beyond stupid and futile and absurd, unless and until we have a perfect method of how to know what's true in the first place. It might be nice to get a sense of, yeah, there's a lot of fake news, or, you know, it's very slanted news and so forth, and propaganda, but then, you know, where does that leave us if we, in terms of, you know, knowing what's right? Like people's way of knowing what's true is some mixture of sort of like an intuitive rudimentary scientific method that's used when we're infants and on, right? Where we're kind of observing the world, creating a model of it, creating expectations about how the world works, right? Whether our mom's going to come when we cry, whether an object remains permanent when it appears to disappear when it goes behind a chair, or or behind someone's back. Does a ball still exist after it goes behind someone's back? So we form, theories and expectations about the world. Our mind makes a model about the world, and we'll tell children, think about this. Like we'll say that phrase to kids, think about that. Well, think and then say such and such. Well, if you tell a child to think, you're implying what? That they already know how, right? And people can do something called thinking, but the part of what's included in what we kind of imply when we talk about thinking is we'll figure out what's true for yourself. And then as people grow older, at some point, we have this idea of thinking for yourself, right, as something that is what better people do, rather than people that are particularly naive or thought of as kind of stupid or whatever, right? If we say, quote, such and such a person, Sarah or Bob, they don't think for themselves, right? That's obviously has a negative connotation, right? But that type of stuff can be said. So, but if people say that kind of thing, it means there's such a thing as thinking for yourself. That's a higher aspiration, a better move, right, to do than to not think for yourself. But if we suppose that we or other people should think for themselves, then that implies or presupposes that they're able to in the first place. And the foundation of thinking for yourself would have to be to have some method by which to figure out whether an idea that you're thinking about is correct or not, right? Now, there's plenty of ideas that really aren't in the realm of what we can know for sure, like things in history, like when I bring up, the idea that's in people's psyches these days about like fake news, for example. Well, you can't, there isn't necessarily a way to know what's exactly true when it comes to, reporting in the world or whatever, right? But certainly we can have a surround what we can't know, and we can't with an idea of what's reasonable and also things that we can know. So not everything's going to fall into the category of, well, you can know it for sure. However, even figuring that out, having a sense of, well, what is in the category of things I can figure out, or at least some minimal starting point of things we can know for certain. If we look at the opposite of the proposition that you can know something at all, the opposite of it is you can't know anything. If you can't know anything, you have to profess that you haven't the slightest idea whether rape is bad or whether Putin invading Ukraine is bad, right? It's either the case that you haven't the slightest idea, right? Literally no idea of whether that's correct or not, or if you profess to even say, well, it's 51% more certain, or I think it's more likely that it's bad that Putin is invading Ukraine than not, right? To make that statement, that's professing of a belief or it's affirming that something's true. The minute you affirm that anything is true whatsoever, you're implying that you have a method by which to determine whether an affirmation is true or not, whether a statement that you're professing to be true is correct or not. And yet, if we look back on our own lives, when did that method get created or discovered or examined or learned? When? Were you born with it? Was everyone born with an ability like Putin? Was he born with an ability to know just what's true? Well, it couldn't have been, right? Because if someone has an ability to know what's true, then they'll at least somewhat oversimplified to say that it couldn't have been, but I mean we have a sense of what that must of that. We're obviously people are not born being able to determine what's true with perfect accuracy, right? We would just basically all agree on things that can be known. Now the one caveat when I say obviously, that some or many people or all people listening to this might not there might be, there's a bunch of things we can know are true, like there's in life. And so as you gain the ability to know how to know what's true, which I can share with you. I'm not like talking about this theoretically. I worked through this, right, for decades. This is all going to be odd if someone's at all like new to me. It's going to be odd because I'm coming from a place that's pretty unique. Let me say something that admittedly can easily sound very pompous, but it's very, but the possibility of it is weirdly important. So it's possible that I'm the best philosopher like ever. So at least be aware, not that it's likely, or even in your mind it may or may not be possible as a listener, if you're new to me especially, but at least by me saying that, it still opens up a certain category or sense, right? If you're don't even have that possibility, then it's you're kind of closed off, to a certain thing. So there might be something new and newly awesome about what you're going to get from me. All right, so there's things we can know, and as you understand how to know what's true, and as you accumulate some of those things, then it's clear that other people don't know how to know those things because they don't know the answers to some of these things we can know what's true. So they don't have, or they haven't been using the method, especially very important things people would kind of rapidly figure out if they were able to figure out what was true. So I'm not going to spend a long time on whether we're born with it. It's pretty obvious people aren't, right? So if we're not born with it, then you'd have to acquire it at some point, and that would either be from other people. Who's that going to be? Your government, teachers, or who? Your parents? Most of us probably don't think that our parents are, accurate about everything. And our teachers, won't get started there. And who? Media, movies. And then that would leave yourself to stop and figure it out. And then you can just ask yourself, did you stop at some point in your life when you were 16 or 20 or 25 or 30 or whatever, and just say, as long as it takes, I realize now that I never could have had a way to know that was true, that like having some way that you have no idea whether it works and it's just some random method of knowing what's true doesn't cut it, right? You would need to have some method that somehow worked on itself, right? Like the method would have to be able to be turned on itself and somehow be foundational and know that it's foundational in some way, where you would have a method of knowing what's true and know that that method was correct through some perfect way. It would all have to be foundational, perfect, understandable, knowable in some way. But the odd thing is, unless you have, that might sound pie in the sky to some people, again, early on with meeting me and stuff. I'm talking to an audience that most people on this webinar know me well, and they've followed me for years, and so it's a little bit of a difference between someone who's new and that. But by followed me for years, I mean, of course, listened. I don't mean like followed, like in lockstep, or like they're a follower or something. Anyhow, like followed along with. So if we, it's either the case that you've personally stopped, recognized this all-important question, and worked on it until you got it straight, which I've never really met a person other than myself who's done that, like from scratch on their own. We did talk to some, like with each other on the Hero series, right, on YouTube, where some of you listening, right, have really been working on that question, have gotten a certain amount, and then we're really kind of ready and prepared when you heard me kind of explain it. So excellent. But anyway, if you have worked through it and figured it out on your own, excellent. I love that, right? I'm not in any way looking to be superior or be the first or the only or whatever. But in terms of just practical real life, right, presumably you haven't done that. If you haven't done that, and it's because you haven't realized something that you could have realized. I don't mean that you morally should have realized. I just mean that in theory you could have realized it. Which is that, again, everything is absurd unless you address that one question. Like what's the basis for me making decisions, right? Or the basis for me having a foundation of my knowledge or outer frames of my belief system. Without such, and that basis would have to be solid in a way that, like the standard ones that people have in practice, they feel or seem kind of solid. Mostly they're ignored, right? Most of the people don't really address this very clearly. But some combination of like science and or revelation, like the Bible or that sort of thing, is kind of people's foundation, right? Regarding science, there's just a whole lot of problems. First of all, in practice, science tends to mean authority, right? Really, both of those come down to authority, right? Like, well, basically someone that I like or respect or showed me love or some group of those people made me feel like yeah, that's good. And then after that, there's justification. Might not feel that way, but that's kind of how human minds work and people's psyches work, right? Is you kind of feel like you, for whatever reason, like you want to believe something based on a good feeling, usually about particular people, right? And then based on how they come across, authoritative, loving, etc. And then we justify, right? And people come up with stuff. But the scientific method can explore within a certain box, but it is limited in all sorts of ways, including it doesn't even work on itself. Like the scientific method can't, and the idea of empiricism, like, well, something if you can do a double-blind study. Well, there's no double-blind study showing that you can only know things based on doing a double-blind study. Does that make sense? Like it doesn't work on itself. The scientific method doesn't show that the scientific method works. A different type of thinking shows that the scientific method is the right way to go about things within a certain realm, within certain circumstances. But it's not, first of all, something that we actually do. Most of what we call science is just, again, authority, right? I mean, there was a certain culture, there's a certain eye-opening example, like when Fauci says, "I am science," right? Now, that's kind of course, absurd on its face, but at the same time, it represents a reality, and that is that in reality, in real life, right, in the real world, science is first, it's a number of things. It's a marketing term, right, to make something sound all great. Furthermore, it's science says such and such, science agrees, right? So the scientific method can't be like unanimous or have a consensus, right? Obviously, then you're talking about people. And so a lot of times people talk about science, or talk about a consensus, and often among like government approved experts and so forth. So as soon as we start to look at science as an epistemology, it is limited in all sorts of ways. And in the real world, it's used as like a marketing term. It's used as a kind of a consensus idea of authority figures. And so it breaks down pretty quickly. And of course, with the pandemic, right, we see all kinds of breakdowns, right? I have fairly mainstream views regarding pandemic stuff, right? But by the way, like Louis Pasteur himself is kind of a sort of hero of mine in a certain sense. Like for the biographies that I read when I was young, he's just awesome, right? And now, of course, I don't know him. History is history. You don't know exactly how the person was. But he really went deep into disproving spontaneous generation, which I thought was super cool. People used to think that flies spontaneously generated in meat. Scientists it was the consensus, at the time, was that bacteria spontaneously generated in like chicken broth, flies spontaneously generated in meat. Like they just kind of popped into being in meat, literally. and they had experiments like like seeming to prove this. And then he had these like special flasks, and he did all these experiments, and then he wanted to get rid of smallpox and and other things, anthrax, and some of the first vaccines. I don't know that he was the one that invented the idea of the vaccine or not. But anyway, but we see kind of science being used, as like a bludgeon, and obviously changing right and left, and then policies where people say they follow the science, and yet they change here and there without science changing. So it's just on the face of it, pretty easy to see the ludicrousness lately, just in real time, in real life. And then the other type of epistemology, which once again really comes down to something similar with authority, it comes down to revelation, right, of different religions, and they have their book. And I am a Christian, but I differ from Christians historically and in practice and in real life regarding epistemology. And you can't, just the same way that someone can't learn how to know what's true, you can learn, like from me or from theoretical other people that might know it, or in the future if it's more widely known and it could be taught to kids, but they would still have to apply it themselves and basically check it and do it themselves. Similarly, it's not logically possible to know something, like it becomes circular, right? If someone's like, well, I know the Bible's true. Even the phrase, I know the Bible's true, what's true? Does like the Bible, let's say you don't read the Bible, let's say it's sitting on your desk. Does it emanate truth into your brain in an infallible way so that you just know truth? First of all, then everyone that had a Bible on their desk would agree. Or will you say, well, no, David, you have to read it. Well, read it in what language? Do you read a translation of it? Which translation? Do you read it in the original? Do you have to speak the language? Can I read it in French even though I don't speak French? Well, no, why not? Why, if the Bible just imposes only correct truth upon my brain, it could be fully inspired by God. It could be, I think Jesus was, the Christ, Son of Man, Son of God. So, it was all analogies, but it points to divine, right? All of that could be correct, but how can the Bible be true in a way that that's all I need? That's my epistemology. That's how I know what's true. Again, the meaning of that would have to be, you would just have to impose perfect truth on your mind. Now, if someone says, well, the truth is there, I need to study it and think about it. Well, then whatever you're using to think about it, you'd want to get that as right as possible, right? Does that make so? One way or another, there's something deeper we need. And then to even know that the Bible or was revelation from God, you would need something deeper or other than the Bible to figure that out. And particularly if you cared all about sharing truth with other people, then you would want something that could relate to that. We need to be on the same playing field, be dealing in the same currency with other people. And so if the only way someone could know that the Bible is true is to have a prior belief that the Bible is true, you end up obviously in a circular, impossible situation, a chicken and the egg problem. So again, I'm glossing over things, like any of these could go on, and I will. I'll talk to people. I'll actually plan to refer back to questions. Let me see. Actually, are there any questions, objections, things so far? People can. I don't expect there to already be typed, but if anyone wants to. Lauren said it's also possible that everyone on this webinar is extremely lucky to have stumbled upon the greatest philosopher ever. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. The recordings will be well watched, just not quite the same as being live. Yeah, agree. By you yourself, exactly, because you were saying, Julie, that you couldn't necessarily be live for a while. Agreed, says Muhammad. I appreciate that. Okay. All right, so people tend to need a little break here and there when listening to me. Anyway, so it's kind of a lot. How do you prove your method of knowing something? Yeah, great question. I'm just gonna, for that, I'll just keep, right, exactly. Well, what we can realize is that if there isn't something foundational to have a method to know what's true, then and I already have in the law of implication explained series, I go into it things pretty well. I can always talk more, and I am literally talking more. But yeah. So it doesn't, and it turns out that it ends up not being an infinite regress. If there wasn't a method of knowing what's true that worked on itself and that was knowable, then once again, we would have to say, I have no idea whether rape is bad, or insert whatever clearly bad thing that you don't want to say that about in there is, right? You'd have to know nothing. If someone punched you in the face, you'd have to say, I haven't the slightest idea whether they just punched me in the face, right? I have the slightest idea whether I need to eat anything to survive, right? Whether I have no idea whatsoever whether eating pure sugar is probably worse for your health than eating, mostly vegetables and such, right? So there's not a lot definitive I'd say about health, but I was thinking the other day, well, at least I guess I could say that's a pretty good one. So if you go extreme enough, right, you can get to a point when you're pretty confident. All right. So now there's another, so epistemology, the thing here is really about its importance, not that I'm getting into it through example by talking about the proof of God here. I've also talked about it more specifically, and I will continue to do so. But my epistemology rant is really about its importance. It's number one, that you would have had to stop and figure it out from scratch in a world where that doesn't exist, which in fact is what I did. But that's the only way, right? You can't, the only other thing someone could do is learn it from someone, right? You either figure it out for yourself, you either start with it, which we did, or you figure it out for yourself, or you learn it, right? Those are the only options. If, like, again, I'll show you how it's opposites, right? You either started with it or you didn't. Given that you didn't, then you either figure it out for yourself or you learn it. But the thing about learning it, I already kind of dealt with that. You really can't, you can be helped on your journey to figure it out for yourself, but you at least have to check it over for yourself. Really, math, like arithmetic, basic math, is a subset of thinking and knowing what's true that is basically correct and works. And when it comes to math, well, since basic math is done and taught correctly, like your calculator on your computer and or people doing basic math will pretty much give you the correct answer every time, right? Practically speaking, do I know that? Of course, I don't know every computer, and so forth. But that's a statement you can at least feel is very reasonable. Why did I bring this up? Because you can teach math. Now, it's interesting to see what underlies math. I'll use an example from math in the next slide. But one of the things with math, if you look down here at logic, what makes basic math work so well is that it's a rare case where the meanings of the words like 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and plus and minus and equals, they actually don't change in people's minds. Like, as people do basic math, the nature of it is that it is doable for people and predictable, that people will not change the meanings of those words and the concepts. Because they don't, that's all you have to do to think accurately ultimately. But when we get outside of math, because of things people don't realize, and I'll fill in the blanks over time. But because of things people don't realize, the meanings of their words change, and they can't really keep them from changing. They're too inherently unstable or waffling around for people to use the words consistently. As simple examples, what I mean, right? The word science changes meaning greatly in usage and culture, and people will take advantage of a word changing and act like it's not changing, right? They'll say like, well, aren't you going to follow the science, right? Science says such and such. Well, the scientific method can't talk, right? So if science in one breath means the scientific method, and then another breath it's anthropomorphized and it's created, you know, it says such and such, and it can be followed, right, and listened to, then we must have changed the meaning of the word science to mean something other than the scientific method. It's okay to use a word, however, but what's not okay is to change the meaning of a word while acting like you didn't, right? That's the basic error in thought. But it can't just be willed away. You can't just stop doing it one day, because the inherent nature of the way that we think and misunderstandings about how existence works, and I'll the next slide I'll start to get into this a little bit more specifically. Then people are just unable to do this. They're just overwhelming. Virtually every word and concept they're trying to use is inherently blurry and unstable and has multiple meanings, and like inherently multiple meanings in a way that they don't realize. And so you are just trying to, like, it's impossible to try to keep, it's hard enough to keep like one word straight, but when you're dealing with like 20 at a time and they're all moving around, and our mind isn't telling us that they're moving around, it's just way out of people's ability, without like a paradigm shift, like without gaining an understanding beneath what's going on. And we're going to need that in order to really understand how to know that God exists. Now, okay, so I have this number on here in the middle, 438,000. What is that? Well, I went to my calculator, and this stands for hours. And if we give people a pass on their first 20 years, then, and if you live to 70, right, hopefully you'll live longer than that. But if you live to 70, that's 50 years. So 50 years, forget about leap year, 50 years of 24 hours, right? 24 times 365 times 50, if I punch the right numbers in the calculator, is this, 438,000 hours. So that's how many hours you have in your kind of adult life, roughly speaking, right? Very roughly speaking. I'm bringing this up because without necessarily realizing it, you're going to come to this webinar, and maybe webinar series, right, as it continues, with a preordained conclusion in your mind about how much time, effort, etc., it should take you, it's worthwhile to invest in understanding how to know what's true and or how to know that God exists, like basically in this topic, whatever this topic is. You came expecting to hear how to know God exists, and you're going to hear that, and you are here. Everything I'm saying from the beginning of this webinar is exactly me addressing the question of you knowing that God exists. I care very much about that question. It gives me a big responsibility. If I just had discovered things that were, you know, could make you rich, which I have, then, or you know, get you a great relationship with someone you're crazy about, and likely, can't guarantee that. If you get it by a bus tomorrow, you probably won't. And you don't have a relationship right now, you probably won't get it by the time the bus ends up running you over. If, God forbid, of course. Making light of your death or anything, but just, in addition to a whole bunch of other stuff that I understand and figured out in life, then of course I know this topic as well. I mean, of course I'm claiming to, I don't mean of course I know. So your mind already has concluded about how, you know, has a rough estimate of, or it's gonna, as it goes along, it's gonna act as if it has a good sense of, well, is this worth it? You know, how much effort is it worth it? Well, so if you devoted 1% of your life, you know, you're talking to God one day, and you're like, God, you know, you know, well, I tried to figure out whether you existed, but you know, it wasn't really. I put in enough. I put in a certain amount of effort, and I felt like that was plenty, right? Well, 1% of your entire adult life would be what, right? You take 2 zeros off of here, that'd be 4,348 hours. So this webinar was 4,380 hours long. I don't know if YouTube would let me upload that, but then that would be 1% of your life. So just a bit of perspective, the basic thing is, first of all, if you don't have a method of knowing what's true, then you should start to see, opening your eyes to all these conclusions your mind's giving you, despite having not a method of knowing what's true accurately. But this sort of can illustrate of how ridiculous your mind can be. It's going to give you a sense, like if this webinar, it could be 2 hours long and feel like, wow, this is a long time. I wish it'd get to the point, right, and so forth. Because 0.001% of my life is like way too long to deal with a question of epistemology itself, how to know what's true, and the nature of God and God's existence. Right? On the face of it, that's beyond absurd, right? Everything in your life is absurd, and as a practical matter, sabotaging and inefficient, and you're going to miss out on all kinds of sex and money and so forth without the proper epistemology, right? But then you can also know the why you're created, the purpose of existence, where it's all going, all that stuff, and just kind of have incredibly great news actually at the basic foundation and surrounding your understanding of life. So maybe you can recognize that your mind is not going to be estimating very well on how, if your mind has not already told you that epistemology is basically all that matters, that it's the only the biggest, the most relevant bottleneck in your life. If you've watched the beginning of my definitive series where I talk about bottlenecks as the only concept that really matters when it comes to strategy, and strategy is everything. In a situation that we have in life where we have limited resources and stuff that we want, then the only thing that matters in a situation like that is allocating those resources, right? Like towards bottlenecks, towards the most important bottlenecks, which means therefore the only thing that matters is understanding the whole situation. The more understanding you have, the better you can identify bottlenecks and allocate resources to those best. So if your mind hasn't already told you that the most important bottleneck in your life is your epistemology, your way of knowing what's true, then you're not at even square one when it comes to strategy. So, and I say that because, like, maybe let me help you, please. Love to help you. Not for nothing. Right? There's nothing to buy now, or I have no plans ever. Nothing I need you to do for me. But I'd love to help you with this, right? So, and I need to point out that really, whatever it takes would be a great way to approach this topic. Rather than intuitive, like with the kind of without realizing it intuitively with a ticking clock that's actually extremely brief and small and absurdly so on the topic. Okay, great. So let's go on to slide 2. Now I may look to overview things here. So I'll take a stab at that and maybe I'll end up not doing that kind of either by accident or for whatever. Okay, so I have 2 slides here. One is what's on this slide where I wrote mental objects, consciousness, screen, reason versus faith. So this deals with a certain preparation where if you don't have this, then you don't have the tools to even begin to think accurately about this topic, really any topic. Well, that's not true. There's plenty of things in life that you can do smartly and cleverly and well without understanding this stuff. But understanding the purpose of life, who you are, and the truth about God and God's nature and goodness and so forth is not one of those things. So lots of stuff you can do well. And probably another thing that you're not going to do very well in relative to how you could do is relationships. And they really, you're making money and then having all kinds of nice feelings and intimacy and all that stuff as well. And a sense of well-being is going to really, if you can have much better relationships, you might think, and correctly so, that you have nice relationships now, but really you can have a great situation as you understand this stuff too. So both God and sex can be your benefits here. All right, so and I'm actually going to do a better overview than that, but just to also take a look at this quickly. Then once you have the right underpinning, once you're done thinking, see, as long as you can ask the question and it feels like it makes sense to you, like, well, why couldn't the universe do this or create that or whatever? We'll get rid of that here. And then it's pretty easy. This slide's pretty simple and easy. it's pretty easy to understand that God exists when you, it's not even having the right lens necessarily as the right place to stand to compare with. What a lens does, kind of conceptually speaking, or a perspective is what I mean, is you sort of see through it and it kind of imposes meaning on what you're doing. So like, for example, if you speak English and you read something in English, that's like a perspective. It imposes meaning on the word, or it retranslates the meaning back from, of course, the person who wrote what you are reading had maybe similar meaning, ideally, right? Had similar meaning in their mind when they wrote. Obviously, there could be something lost in translation, even between English and English, between one person and the next. But a person, of course, had an meaning, an idea in their mind. They wrote stuff, and now you're reading it, and you're kind of projecting that meaning back with a perspective, right, of the English language plus your kind of construct of reality and so forth. There's another aspect of thinking besides just using a perspective. Typically, it's much quicker and easier to use a perspective, and most of the things you want to think about and do in life, a perspective will do it for you. Kind of a lens that imposes meaning on things in essence. It's kind of like pre-created meaning. Like when you go into reading a book in English and when you speak English, there's all kinds of meaning and mental objects like that you have for like all the words, unless of course if you don't know a word or if they're referring to a concept that you've never experienced. Maybe it's an emotion you've never experienced or a place you've never been or whatever, then you don't have that meaning to impose, right? So that makes it more vague for you. Whenever you do already have the meaning to just project onto what you're reading, then it's quicker and easier in a useful way. So whenever it's appropriate to think with a perspective, then that's great. And most of the time in life, it's appropriate. Now we want to have like our perspectives can be kind of as accurate and clear as possible. And then, so by improving kind of the ideas, the beliefs, the certain meanings of words or whatever in our mind, we can have kind of better perspectives. And that's great to do. There's separately, it's kind of laborious, but can get us places that like, so a perspective, we kind of need to have it in order to have it, in order to use it, right? There's times when there isn't a perspective yet on something, and then we need to be able to think sort of comparatively, where we're using something that we could think of more of as a foundation or like a foothold to compare things with. And again, instead of projecting meaning because you don't have the meaning yet, then you need to compare. So I had to do this for myself because I don't really have anywhere to get answers to these questions from, right? One kind of useful foothold that I used to kind of break out was realizing that if something changes, it can't be the exact same thing. If somebody actually compared their thinking and their meanings of their words with that idea that if something changes, it can't be the same thing, then it would be pretty mind-blowing. So, for example, you could do that if you want, on your own time. And so maybe if you're listening, maybe or might already have done that to some degree. Literally yourself, right? If you're referring to yourself, like whatever, I was going to say whatever pronoun, but that has an even different meaning these days. But when you think of yourself, you're basically using the same word, right? Like your name. It's not literally the same word because depending on the part of speech in a sentence, right? Me, myself, I, your name. But one way or the other, there's like kind of a name for yourself, right? That you have, like somewhat metaphorically speaking, but what I'm saying is very relevant. So you have this idea of yourself, and the idea is that it's your usage of that meaning, that word, is that you're the same now and in the past and now, and yet at the same time that you change. You might say, well, no, actually, David, I think I changed. Well, the problem is you're implying that you're the same, right? If someone punches you in the face, you will say to them perhaps, well, why did you just hit me? I mean, you might also, do more than that, but one of your reactions will be, why did you hit me? But they punched you in the face a couple seconds ago. And so me, a couple seconds ago, if you say, why did you hit me? You mean me now. And so you're equating you a couple seconds ago with you now. Do you see? So that implies, you're implying clearly that it's the same person. If they say, no, I punched somebody else, you'd say, what the heck are you talking about? You punched me, right? So it must be that it's the same thing that got punched between 2 seconds ago and now. But you also at the same time believe that you're different than you were 2 seconds ago. And I could apply the same thing. We could magnify that, and we could use other examples where you're clearly applying. If someone says, where did you go to college? And if I'm 48 and I say where I went to college right when I was like 18 or 19 to like 22, right? So if I answer that question, I'm implying that it's the same person that went to college, right? Who did you go to, right? Where did you go to college? So then I'm the same between then and now, but at the same time, I think I've changed, right? So which is it? Right? Is it the same or different? And if you try to resolve that, you find that you basically can't with it's not even something you think of as a worldview. When we think of a worldview, it's like, what's your political politics, or what's your view on being a positive person, or what's your religion, that kind of thing, right? It's almost deeper than what we normally call your worldview, but it sort of still fits in the category. I might say your worldview is with something even that you're hardly aware of, like you're a worldview that's kind of even deeper than what we see as worldviews, that kind of people have in common, even despite the fact that their worldviews might seem different or be very different, might actually be very different, right? The worldview of Ukraine right now is very different than the worldview of I was going to say Russians, but actually right now Russians aren't really aware that there's even a war going on, in case you didn't know that. I have people in my family, they're my in-laws. A couple days into the invasion, they had no idea. Like it's not reported at all to them. Anyway, but worldviews are different. So, but you can't, without tools that you either figure out for yourself or I give you, you can't. This is what I mean when I was saying earlier in this webinar. You can't keep the meanings of your words consistent. Don't have the basis. You don't have the basis for it. You can't use the idea of me without at the same time meaning you don't change, while at the same time believing you do. There's no way to resolve that with the usual foundation or kind of false foundation that people have for understanding life, the universe, and everything, right? To steal from Douglas Adams. So these concepts here, reasons and causes. So people's idea, our mind, going back to this slide, let's just start here with mental objects. I can even put and causes here. Your mind, or I don't even have to say your mind, it gets one way or the other, it appears in your awareness, mental objects. You don't think of them as mental objects, you often think of them as objects. And causes are basically fabricated for you and put into your awareness. So what do I mean by that? Now, I'm about to say something that even if you've been following me for a while, you might not really be aware of. So because to know that God exists, really you just need to understand causes, but to understand or how the nature of cause, and also the nature of that what you normally think of as stuff that can cause stuff cannot. And then when you get that, you'll be able to understand about God, like kind of instantly. So if it seems like I'm talking about something else or something deep in a way that's not necessary, it is. And it's everything, the next step, super easy. So I'm going to tell you something here that's just radically important and profound. You don't need it for a lot of stuff in life, but then you do need it for a lot of important deep stuff. But that, again, that deep stuff will bear on your day-to-day relationships, and it'll bear on understanding that God exists, which then frames your entire understanding of reality. I'm well aware that people who already believe that God exists they might not be watching this webinar in the first place, but they tend to think that, why do I need to know? I already know. But I'm talking about something really different than what people think of as knowing, which is mostly just BS, nonsense. All right. So let me just say this to start with, and then I'll explain. Again, I want to use the phrase "your mind creates." It's not as simple as your mind creates. So again, it's kind of created for you. It turns out that between like God and your mind and such, the following thing is created. Again, people starting with me at this point will lack basic building blocks, and so you need a couple of building blocks at once. So be aware of that, and that's why it might sound difficult or be difficult right now. Is you kind of need at least 2 or 3 or 4 things at once for things to feel solid for you, and so you're going to go through a period of it's going to be hard. Your mind might wander. You might have to watch this a few times, whatever. All right, so that's understandable, but that's why I started with the hours and do what it takes. It's not going to be that hard. I'll guide you through it. It's going to be pretty darn quick compared to how important it is. Extremely quick compared to how important it is. But it may not be instant, and there might be a sense of confusion. That's the kind of the main bottleneck. And then this is the next one of understanding this. So I'm oversimplifying when I say your mind creates, but that's good enough for now. Your mind creates mental objects. What you think of as real objects, like a table or your computer, those seem like real. They are objects are created as in one sense, a figment of your imagination. There's an underlying reality, and I'll make a metaphor that'll help in a second, but I just kind of want to say something here. What's real is like a difference. So let's give a couple of examples. If we talk about light, how it appears, I don't mean like the speed of light, but color. So when you see blue, for example, it's kind of known scientifically and accurately. I'm using this as kind of something you sort of already know or could know. It's like a little bit scientific, but not really. It's kind of science that's fairly well known, and you can certainly verify it. Is that when you see blue, that's basically based on the difference of an electron changing its orbital and emitting a photon from the difference in energy between that. And that's how photons are emitted. They have a certain wavelength and so forth, right? Light's weird. Light can behave like both a particle and a wave at the same exact time, depending on how what your experiment is. And that's kind of unresolved in science as far as I know right now. Although what I'm explaining here can help resolve it, but I'm not resolving it on this webinar. But there's a difference, right? And so when you see blue feels like something positive and real, like like a blue ball, right? It feels like a ball that's hard and round, and then it's blue, right? Or it's like it feels like it is blue. Blue is not an object, but it's like a quality of an object, right? We would say just normally. I'm not being philosophical when I say that. I'm just identifying that this is I'm giving you a metaphor, and the metaphor itself is common knowledge. The concept I'm using the metaphor for is not, but the idea of seeing a blue ball, right? I'm not, everything I'm saying in terms of the metaphor itself is common knowledge or not controversial or whatever. So blue feels real, but it's actually based in difference, and even in people's current worldview, right? Scientifically, they kind of believe both, right? Like we all feel what's called naive realism, which is like what you see is what you get. Like that when you see a blue ball, it's because there really is a blue ball that exists just as it feels and looks like. At the same time that we feel that and we operate on that, we kind of know it's not true if we stop and think about it in a different way in terms of what we learn in kind of like high school science. Right? There's no real blue that's imposed somewhere between our photons and our visual system and our neurons, and by the time we are aware of it, right? the color is imposed, somewhere in our mind, right, and brain. In real life, there's like photons, so to speak, right? That again, I'm not telling you that's true. I'm saying that's the normal way people look at the world, and there's a correctness to it. And so your mind, somewhere along the way, this object, this blue ball, is fabricated and feels real, and it works, right? Like if you try to catch it, you'll catch it. It won't slip through your fingers. I mean, like it won't go through like right straight through your hand. What I'm talking about is a little bit like what I'm ultimately explaining to you about this idea with mental objects. It's a little bit like parallel to Newtonian physics and what Einstein figured out, and like both quantum physics and relativity, right? Relativity deals with like as you approach the speed of light, and quantum physics deals with as you get like infinitely small, right? And in both of those cases, Newtonian physics breaks down. However, neither quantum physics nor relativity is ever going to show that Newtonian physics is wrong in the sense that when two cars like collide straight up, they're not going to pass through each other. There's going to be an accident as we expect, right? So no amount of quantum physics or relativity is going to change the fact that the real world still or the normal day-to-day world still functions that way, right? Similarly, what I'm talking about here about mental objects, the world will function the same way. I'm not going to disprove that the world seems to work normally the way it normally works, right? When no matter what I talk about today on the webinar, when you walk outside and you step on the sidewalk or your lawn or whatever, it's going to be solid. And it's all going to work like normally, obviously. However, quantum physics and relativity is very relevant, and as you approach the extremes, Newtonian physics breaks down and it's false. It doesn't work, right? Newtonian physics says that if you're like riding in a car and you throw a ball and you want to know how fast that ball is going right when you throw it, then you add the speed at which you're like throwing the ball and the speed of the car, right, together, and that's how fast the ball's initially traveled, right? At the speed of light, that can no longer work, right? Because if you have a car traveling half the speed of light and you shine a flashlight, then normally the speed of light from the flashlight would have to be the speed of light, right? If you add half the speed of light of the car traveling, the light can't travel at 1.5 times the speed of light. If the speed of light is constant, the only thing that can give is time. So time basically slows down in a certain way, right? That's relativity. Of course, giving a tiny little smidgen of it, but that's where the issue lies. And it turns out, scientifically speaking, that the speed of light does remain constant, and that something weird happens, right? Or would happen if that were the case, right? For other reasons, air, resistance and stuff. You're not going to be making a car going half the speed of light. But similarly, the normal understanding of the world, where we think of our computer as real and hard and having color and all that stuff, or a ball is that way, it breaks down and screws us up at the extremes. And what I mean by the extremes is like when we're trying to think about why we exist or who we are, or like the deepest frames and questions and beliefs in life that end up framing everything else break down as people normally see things. So normally naive realism is okay, right? Normally you can function just great thinking that the ball is real. Okay, let's use a different example. So in a computer game, let's say you're a guy in a computer game and you have a gun, and thinking of the gun as firing like real bullets that are made of metal and such, that will work great, right? In terms of if there's like enemies and you have to shoot them and they have some armor or whatever, the idea that your bullets are made of metal, or then you get other bullets made of a stronger metal or a harder metal, whatever, and that penetrates better, right? Whatever, right? All of that can work in terms of thinking that there really are metal bullets, and these bullets are stronger and they can penetrate the enemy's armor better, and I'm running out of bullets, I need more ammunition, all that stuff, right? Again, the idea is you're playing a video game and you're thinking of it as if it's real. And that works great within the video game, right? It just doesn't work great if you actually think that there's real metal in the screen or in the computer somewhere, right? That's not true, you see? So the bullets that you have in your gun in the game, they are actually real in a certain sense, right? They're real within the context of the computer game. So if someone were to say, or if someone were to play the game thinking the bullets aren't real, then that would actually be detrimental and confuse them inside the game. Similarly, I'm not trying to tell you that the ball or the computer is not real inside the world that you're used to thinking of and thinking within. It works great to think of your computer as real in its own way, and it certainly is based on its own reality or code or or whatever. Just like in a computer game, there's a basis for the bullets that you're picking up, right, in the code and the processing of the game, right? So it's not that there's no underlying code, there is, right? So there's something underpinning what's going on in the game. There's a physics engine, or at least in my example, if the game has a physics engine, there's a physics engine, and there's rules and the way that it works that within the context of the game make a certain type of sense and have their reality. If we were to talk about Middle Earth, like in J.R.R. Tolkien's books, right, of Lord of the Rings and so forth, then we could talk intelligibly within that reality that's created. However, the reality of what's in those books with elves and Yurks, I guess it is, or like orcs or whatever, ants like treants or whatever, they're real within that context, and then they're not real outside of it. This matters when it comes to causation, causality, whatever the word is. If you shoot a gun in a computer game and you kill the bad guy in the computer game or your opponent or whatever, then what causes what? And there's kind of layers of answers to that question depending on what the context that you're supposed to be answering the question in, right? It's perfectly reasonable and intelligible if you're playing the game with someone to say, you see, if you run out of ammo, then you can't shoot any bullets. You run out of bullets, you can't shoot anyone. You need better bullets to penetrate that guy's armor better. Oh, we can't knock down that wall until we find the explosives, right? That all makes sense in the context of the computer game. But when we're looking at ultimate causes, we need to be able to peel back the layers and not think that there's actual explosives that are causing the wall to fall down. There's no explosives anywhere in the game, even if there are, right, in the game, but there's no actual explosives causing a wall to break down. There's no wall, there's no explosives, except that there's code for the idea, like the kind of video game version of those things. It's going to turn out in life, again, mental objects are so great because they help us think about things. Like your computer and the underlying parts of the computer, and then you can go deeper down to atoms and molecules, right, and so forth. All of those have their own reality, but they're also like metaphors. They're like ideas. Our mind turns them into mental objects, and something's going on. The computer game, the meaning of the computer game can't just be imposed by our mind. It's way too coherent, right? Like someone made the game, and this is not my proof of God right now. I'm just helping us understand things. Okay. I'm aware that an atheist or an evolutionist would incorrectly, but still it wouldn't prove it to them if I say, look, a computer is designed and a book is designed, and look, isn't the world designed? I get that that's not adequate. All right. I mean, it's an oversimplification. It ends up it's correct, but it's not helpful enough, and it's not kind of how I'm gonna help people understand that God exists. So we want to grasp the idea of mental objects and be able to understand the level in which they're real and not real, and understand ultimately they can't cause things. Just like the number 3, for example, is very intelligible and extremely useful as a concept, right? And all the other numbers. They're super useful, super important for life. You know, we need it for commerce and lots of other things. But 3 can't do anything. It can't cause anything. When we're teaching a child the meaning of 3, what do? We use objects like 3 apples, you see, because it's more tangible. But just like 3 can't do anything, it turns out that wind can't do anything. And so similarly, a baseball bat can't do anything. And it turns out the universe can't do anything as we understand it. But it ends up being the same type of thing, just that people don't realize how it works. They don't realize because they keep equivocating. They keep changing meanings of words and concepts without realizing. And they violate the very basic idea that something can change and be the same thing, such as the universe. And they subscribe to naive realism, which they themselves contradict, right? Like again, we feel like a ball is solid and blue while knowing through other scientific models and understanding about atoms and photons and light and neurons and so forth, that there is no blue out there. And a ball is almost entirely empty space, much more than 99%, I believe, empty space, based on our understanding of atoms and electrons and so forth. Right? On a molecular atomic level, a ball is nearly all empty space. So people know both at the same time, right? Even something very solid, right, like concrete, is virtually all empty space. So people both believe and don't believe in naive realism. We believe that when you look at a tree, you believe that you kind of see an image of the tree, while and when you're learning about optics in science, like in high school science or wherever, but at the same time, you believe you're seeing the tree. So which is it? Do you see an image of the tree? If I were to say someone, is the tree brown? Then what's interesting is that whatever someone answers is nonsense. Because the tree, the mental, like what people call like the mental image, like when you talk about an optics, right? The idea is that there's an image that's created by the eye and the brain, and you could follow the same logic or thought, or as an example with a picture, right? But anyway, the brown only exists in the image. Again, even according to basic understanding when we're thinking in terms of science and optics and that sort of thing. So if we say, yeah, the tree's brown, or are the leaves green? We could only be referring to a mental image. We cannot possibly be referring to anything out there. Then we say, is the tree hard, or is the tree, does it have roots, right, and so forth. And then one way or the other, people believe that the tree exists outside of the mental image, of course. Like if we say, is the mental image the tree? Well, let's say no. Is the only, like again, it's confusing. Well, is it the tree or is it not? It's an image that people would say, well, it's an image of a tree, right? Well, but then they'll say the tree is brown. So it's not about having the correct answer to that question. It's using that to realize that our basic sense of the world is inherently contradictory, which can open us up to figuring out what's correct. It's not about resolving which is the real tree, the image or the external tree. In essence, neither. Well, the real thing is that our basic understanding of the world has to be wrong, and we need something new that's accurate, that enables us to think about things. And this is going to matter when we're talking about causes. And causes matter to understand God, but causes also matter on a day-to-day level, because for our emotions, our feelings, including you hurt me, therefore I want to hurt you, fairness, which is a bad idea, unless it's a good idea, justice, which is typically a bad idea, which underpins so many problems in relationships, right? So causes of what's going to convince somebody else, what causes a person to do something, that deals with influence and persuasion. What causes a person to respect us? What causes a person to like us? What causes a person to want to get revenge or whatever? You see, our mind is fabricating these things, coming up with a story about these things. What causes a person to do things? Well, they're evil. Well, they're bad. Well, they're doing that intentionally to hurt me. Well, maybe it's not about me. All these things. Why do I sabotage myself? Again, these are statements of cause. Our mind doesn't just get the cause wrong, it gets a deep underpinning of how we view the world and the very nature of what is a cause wrong. So you can't just get the answer right to what causes me to feel bad or feel good, or again, what causes a person to feel persuaded or whatever. You can't possibly get the answer right if you don't even understand the nature of a cause and what it could be and so forth, or different levels of what a cause could be. I'm aware that Aristotle came up with types of causes, or Plato or whatever. That's all off base. It's irrelevant to even talk about what they came up with, because their underpinning of their understanding of existence and the world and our representation of reality, how we perceive it and all that, it's not just that it's wrong underneath where it's wrong. It's built on the wrong foundation without any understanding that there's the foundation that they're using that's off. And they don't have the tools to get it, to get the foundation right. Again, this is why, though, I put the hours. It really can just take us a few hours to get this, even if it feels totally confusing and like, what the crap is he talking about? I thought he was going to show me how to prove that God exists. But these are the tools we need, and they're not that hard to get, given that you have me to help you. But it's also not like super instant, right? This isn't about me persuading you that God exists because you like me and I sound cool and I say something clever and I have great editing and these cool slides and these funny pictures and the whole thing feels good and nice, and then it appeals to the epistemology you were born with, et cetera, right? That's not it. That's not how you know things. That's just how people feel like they know things. I'm not here to persuade, except I need to persuade you to stick with me, to keep going, right? Because that's like the stopgap. That's so to whatever degree I need to persuade you to keep going, there's that. But other than that, it's not about feeling good or feeling that you know or anything like that. It's about getting the foundation that will allow you to understand these things and understand about the nature of cause, and the nature of how to think accurately, which has to do, again, thinking accurately comes down to keeping the meanings of your words, really the meanings of their concepts, but then you have to label the concepts, right? So with something to come back to them later, to hold them, to manipulate concepts and so forth, to add them up and compare with them. And so as we do that, as we compare with concepts, we need to keep the thing we're comparing with still. And that's what underpins accurate thinking. But to be able to keep things still, we need some fundamental understanding of existence and perception in our mind and so forth. That's going to make that even possible. So the next concept here, besides there's a mental object concept, but you can't really understand that very well, even though I've been trying to talk about it, without this concept of consciousness screen. If and when you get this the concept of a consciousness screen, then you're going to have a foundation that like the starting point that's going to be nice and solid. I could have maybe started with that, but whatever. Wherever we start, it's going to be a little tough until a couple of concepts come together, two or three or four. All right. So when we talk about like an image of a tree, like a mental image or whatever, we talk about like perception, and then, okay, so my mind, my eye and my mind create an image of the tree. You might see something in optics where it's like it's reversed in a certain sense, or it's like both, there's two eyes that look at it, and those, both those images are kind of put together by the mind and cleaned up a little bit, photoshopped in the mind basically, and kind of made more, the contrast is accentuated by our mind, so things appear more crisp and clear to us than they quote unquote really are. As we think about that kind of thing, then so normally people split the world into, like, there's an external world that you see and you can feel and it's around you, like the real physical world, and then you have like a mental world, right? Like you feel things in your mind, your memories kind of take place in your mental world when you think about something in your head, right? When you're talking in your head, but you're not saying it out loud into the world, right? Then it's in your head. So we have kind of the idea of there's like kind of a world in our head and there's like a world out there. Well, consciousness screen is different than that, and it splits the world differently. So what gave me the basic tool to start to have the hope of thinking accurately about other stuff is conceptually splitting the world in a certain way, which is everything that I'm currently aware of, and then there's everything else. Instead of thinking of the basis of our knowledge is like our perception, that we're like, normally by default people think of like gaining knowledge about the world by, there's like an external world and then we observe it, we try to gain knowledge about it, and like the external world that's like right in front of our face, the kind of one idea is like, well, that's where that's the beginning of our knowledge, like, where we start to observe the world is like looking around us, right? And then we might start, doing it kind of scientifically, so to speak, kind of systematic. In practice, science is mostly, we hear from other people who did that, or presumably did that, or claim to have done it, or whatever, right? But in many cases have done it, right? There plenty of science has actually gone on and happened and invented all sorts of great things based on that and all kinds of stuff. And I respect that, right? It's really cool, like a lot of the stuff that's been made, right? Nice that we're not living in, caves with nothing, right? So I respect science and things that people have done very much, to the extent that that's been nice and useful. But there's more to thinking than that. And it's not a foundation. It's very useful, but it's hunting around, and it's a way of hunting well and cleverly and cunningly inside of a certain conceptual box. So consciousness screen, by contrast, is everything that you're currently aware of before you jump to conclusions about it. See, normally people's experience of the world and living and everything is one where they both experience their consciousness screen and at the same time have a bunch of conclusions inserted, and they take those conclusions for granted or rubber stamp them. And your consciousness screen, you can be, to the extent that you're aware of a conclusion, that's consciousness screen, but the truth of a conclusion is not. So if I look at a chair, then my mind concludes that's a chair. Or if you look at a person and your mind concludes, well, that's a jerk. Okay. Well, with the chair, your mind might be basically correct. Okay, that's a chair. But there's a lot of conclusions that are like, we're so used to having a whole bunch of conclusions imposed on us at every moment that we're not really aware of it. So you also feel like the chair is hard. You feel like the chair is not really composed of empty space, right? That it's like solid and composed of solid matter. While at the same time, again, we kind of have a scientific, something we probably learned in grade school, where, okay, yeah, in one sense, it's empty space mostly because of that's how atoms and molecules are. right? They're mostly empty space. In between them and in the atom itself is mostly empty space. There's like this nucleus, right? And then these electrons. I'm not, of course, I'm well aware that there's a series of models of electrons, and ultimately you get into probability fields of electrons and so forth. That's just not relevant for what I'm talking about. It's all amounts to the same thing within empty space. I'm not, trying to say that there's actual like balls of, like you have a series of models depending on how far you go with chemistry, over the years in school. Each year they kind of, or each, whatever, they kind of give you something kind of a little bit more accurate and more abstract. But that's irrelevant for what I'm talking about here. So when you look at a chair, I happen to be looking at a chair behind the computer, and right, so your mind gives you a bunch of conclusions about it. Those conclusions are basically functional, and then when it comes to a chair, they're mostly going to be useful unless the chair is about to break, right? And you sit in it, right? And your mind's giving you a conclusion that it'll hold you up. But if that's the case, then your mind could have given you a conclusion that wasn't useful. The truth or not of conclusions is a separate issue, but the more you can notice the difference or distinguish between the conclusions and what you're aware of, the better. And including, as you do that, you're aware of the conclusion. So I can be aware that my mind is telling me that the chair is solid. I could be aware of the conclusion without agreeing or rubber stamping that that's a correct conclusion. I can kind of quarantine the conclusion, as I talked about in the definitive series early on. Regarding, again, we can see a person or experience a person interacting with us and be like, they're causing me to be angry. They're causing me to feel unsafe or get triggered, or ruining my safe space or something like that. Right now we're seeing a conclusion that in the consciousness screen, you're experiencing the experience, the conclusion, you're seeing what you're seeing, you're hearing what you're hearing, you're feeling how you're feeling, all of it, everything about what seems. The consciousness screen is how things seem. Okay. So to put it a little bit simplistically, but maybe usefully, sometimes it's useful to simplify, especially if I point out that I'm kind of oversimplifying. Everything that seems to you in the moment, how things seem, that's your consciousness screen. And you actually know how things seem. If you can distinguish between seems and true about the conclusions. So it's true that how things seem is how they seem. So for example, if I feel like a person is making me angry, right? In truth, it's more complex than that, right? If you get angry, part or all of that can be your own mind contributing to it, right? Your own beliefs and such, right? So, and the more responsibility you take, the more power and ability you might have to change things, right? And to respond usefully to get what you really want, and to, all sorts of stuff. So it is true, however, that it seems to, if it seems to that the other person is making you angry, it is true that it seems like the other person is making you angry, right? If it seems to you that the other person is making you angry, if that's how it seems, that is how it seems. It's true that it seems that way. That distinction of we experience how things seem, where our conscious screen is composed of how things seem, both externally, so to speak, and internally. Your internal feelings, what you feel like is your memory. So you could incorrectly remember an event, and we tend to, if you're able to experiment where you can verify things, you'll find apparently that, according to like studies kind of show this across the board, that our memories are not nearly as accurate as what they feel like. Like our confidence is way overrated, way overblown in terms of our memories. But anyway, when you remember something, how that memory seems to you in the moment and now, that's how it seems. So the memory might be inaccurate if you can compare it with what actually happened a few days ago or years ago or whatever. But the way it seems is still how it seems. And how it seems when you remember it, that seems is in your consciousness screen. this distinction, the more this idea of a consciousness screen becomes kind of tangible to you, the more it becomes a mental object that you have to work with, the better. The consciousness screen as a distinction is not really a mental object that people have to start with. It's not a concept people have, because they split the world differently. It's not a difference that people normally look at specifically. Kind of like a painter might look at a tree and see many different shades of green, because they have the prior concept of these differences, right? Of these different greens. Whereas I, who am not a painter, might look at a tree and be like, oh, the tree's green, and hardly see the different nuances of the colors. Similarly, a person who's not familiar with this idea of consciousness screen doesn't see their consciousness screen as such, right? Again, they kind of distinguish the world differently, and things are blurred together, lumped and split differently. You have a critically important tool, a necessary tool, as you accurately get a sense of what consciousness screen means. I'm gonna take a moment break, and I'm gonna allow people to kind of say stuff about blue balls, the worst, funny ones. The accident there. I'll be back in a moment, and if you want to ask anything or discuss about consciousness screen, I will be back. Whoops. I meant to do that. I'll be right back. I'm back. Great. Okay. I'm enjoying the deep dive on epistemology and keeping words consistent. Is it accurate to say our consciousness screen is the only thing we can know directly? Yes. It's the only starting point for what we know directly. In essence, it's basically the answer is yes. It's our only basis for knowledge, but it's a perfect basis. As you get the idea that you know how things seem to you, now those words that I just said can point to slightly different concepts. So what you want to take from that is that there is a meaning within the wiggle room of what I could have just said in what I said, that you can know, or you do know, you literally do know how things seem to you. You know it perfectly and accurately, and no matter how many people, like if you're looking at an elephant, no matter how many people tell you, if a lot of people tell you that there's no elephant there, you might wonder if you're crazy or hallucinating, right? But no matter how many people tell you that you don't seem to see an elephant, you can know that they're wrong. That kind of points to what I mean. You see? So again, if you think that you're seeing an elephant, if enough people tell you no, there's not an elephant there, you might wonder, right? Even if you're sure they're playing some kind of joke on you, you at least might have to think about it. But if you can see the contrast between if they all tell you that you don't seem to see an elephant, then you can know that they're wrong. No matter how many people, the entire world can tell you that you don't, that how things seem to you is not how they seem to you, and you could know that they're wrong if you get the meaning of what I mean, how things seem. So you could be hallucinating an elephant, but you can't be hallucinating, like even if you're hallucinating an elephant, even if, was it David Hume or someone said like, no, sorry, was it There's a guy, not Hume, was it Kant, who got close, but then they went off. But anyway, this kind of like philosophical idea in the kind of the Reformation or Renaissance era, I believe, maybe 1800s or something. But about, like, can there be maybe we're a barnacle, like somewhere, but we're just or God's, or the devil is basically, could the devil just be imposing, the world on us or whatever? We're really something else, and we're just, being whatever. What's true, I'm talking about the person who said, I think, therefore I am, that one. And I'm blanking out on who said that. It possibly was David Hume, but I might have that off. When people come close to what I'm talking about with conscious screen, they end up meaning something different, or using a different, it ends up being a different concept. I'm not just saying I think therefore I am or something like that. We need to have this specific distinction of conscious screen where we know how things seem to us, period. We know how they seem and we know it perfectly. And when you find the meaning of what I'm saying here that is true, that works, then you'll have what I intend to mean. Okay, because there's a meaning of what I'm saying that is correct and critical. Is this webinar still happening? Is there anything wrong? Yeah, it is. I'll type. Amanda might be in the chat, but not in the webinar. Okay, so we're in the, if you don't know where the chat is, it's in the MeWe group that you can get to from lawofimplication.com. Well, it's an event in there. Mahai says, we're so used to thinking in, thanks to Lawrence, we're so used to thinking in terms of objects, basically everything. So since we are not objects, nor is God, it's kind of impossible for us to imagine us or God with this object-oriented mind, right? What we can do is we can imagine, we think with objects, but what we can do is recognize that we're thinking with an object. See, we can't imagine 3, but that's okay, right? We can't imagine a tree, but we can think of an object, but what it really is, right? But there is no real, like, really, in a certain sense, right? Like, what we can do is stop and look at the difference, and I'll show that with God or with us. So with who you are something that's aware of your consciousness screen, period, to start with, as understanding who you are, right? You're identifying one solid thing, one thing that has to be correct. Once you're clear about the existence of your consciousness screen, because you're directly aware of that, right? You know how it seems. Given that it seems to be there, right? It can't seem to be there without it being there. It exists as it seems. So you exist as someone that is experiencing it, and you have to exist. And that's the difference between you and not you, is you're experiencing your consciousness field rather than not experiencing your consciousness field, rather than being anything else. So you exist as a difference. Now you can then create a positive object that you can picture. So we can't picture differences, we picture objects. And even to picture differences, we're kind of picturing the difference typically between objects. But consciousness screen solves it all, because your consciousness screen is the one thing that is not an object. It's not a mental object. It is what it is. You literally experience it. I can't describe it. You experience it. I don't need to describe it, because how things seem to you is the basis for everything, and it exists, and it seems to you as it is. So you don't need an object for it. And it's your basis. It's great. It's your one and only starting point. It's the one and only thing that's not an object you experience directly. And when you build from there, everything can make sense in the world. Everything outside of your consciousness screen has to be like derived as knowledge. You don't know it immediately and directly. And there's a ton of it you'll never know. right? Basically the configuration of things you often don't know, like the exact, like how many blades of grass are on your lawn, or how many hairs are on your head, or how the traffic is in Paris right now overall exactly, or all the molecules in your chair. There's just obviously tons or unlimited stuff virtually outside of your consciousness screen. But there are truths we can figure out, all kinds of truths we can figure out. We basically do that. I've gone into this in other webinars. We basically do that through opposites and comparing, keeping our things we know consistent. Right. One of my basic things is about property rights, right? The opposite of property rights, we can, if we keep consistent with the idea of property rights, then we can look at what are examples of if we said that property rights are nothing, they don't exist. You own no property. No one owns any property. So people don't, if we're consistent with that, and a subset of that would be people don't own their bodies. So we could take a chainsaw, cut off someone's arm, and it wouldn't be violating anything. There would be no, how would we say it's wrong? They don't own their arm. They don't own any, because we already said they don't own any property. So we just get absurd, right? Every time we come up with examples of being consistent with people owning zero property, then we come up with absurdity that we can't live consistent with. I can't live consistently with someone cutting off my arm with a chainsaw and me saying that's completely fine, no problem whatsoever. I don't own my arm. It's nothing, relative to me, right? So we can demonstrate in all sorts of ways that the idea that we own no property is absurd, doesn't match, doesn't add up, can't live that way for a moment. We can't, it's inconsistent with, it contradicts all kinds of other things that we certainly would want to affirm or live by. And so therefore people must be able to individually own some property. If we're consistent with that, that's when we get to shocking things. Just, it's simple, but totally contradicts what people believe and affirm, right? I have a positive sense of the United States relative to plenty of other countries. I'm not criticizing the United States relative to other countries or not. But in a vacuum, the United States law does not allow you to own any property, period. End of story. That's true. In that sense, the United States is a full tyranny. It's not relevant whether it's a democracy or republic or whatever. It's a full tyranny in the sense that you are not allowed as a subject of the United States. Some people say citizens, but I say subject because it's an absolute tyranny. You can't own any property. So normally people have a mental object of tyranny that has all these features, right? You need a guy with like a mustache, right, and funny hair to be, the leader, right? Or they have to have do certain salutes, or they have to have uniforms, or they have to be like North Korea or whatever, right? We have these mental objects. People compare with those mental objects of tyranny and say, no, the United States is not a tyranny. We're a free country. People repeat that ad nauseum. But you literally can't own any property, not even your body in the United States. The government can legally take any of it at any time. And that's true on so many levels. The very fact that the Constitution can be amended through a vote means that through no participation of your own, anything can be constitutional. Rape, burning people, burning children, any of it can be constitutional. All that has to happen is a 2/3 votes, right? And we're all set, right? So legally, it's all legal. And in the early 1900s, it was decided in a clear thing, you can look it up, that slavery was legal in the United States, as long as the government did it. Only private slavery was outlawed. And we have, the draft, jury duty, and so forth are examples of commandeering your body, taking them over. Draft is an extreme evil form. Jury duty, of course, is mild, but still major, in my opinion, and whatever. Like, it's still, commandeering your body. If we're consistent with the act of jury duty done by an individual toward another individual, we would be horrified, right? If someone commandeered another individual's body, like their neighbor, for 2 weeks, then we would be horrified by that. Again, just comparing, just looking at consistency in our thinking. So there's an example. So the whole, like the belief that people have in terms of government is utterly upside down with simple comparisons. And the fact that they're not, those simple comparisons are typically not made is shows something about, again, our belief in the, like our belief about our fellow man is off. Okay, so consciousness screen, let's see what else is. I'm famous. David Mills said my name. That's really funny. So when I experience the conscious screen, I don't experience it as an object, but when I think about it, I immediately turn into an object. That's great. That's good. That's true. That's a good statement, Mahai. Very, very good. So Mahai wrote, when I experience my conscious screen, I don't experience it as an object, but when I think about it, I immediately turn into an object in a snap. Basically, right? Or you or your mind. It's totally reasonable to say I, but yeah. And even when I say your mind does such and such, that's an oversimplification. In a funny way, God's doing it. So let me give at least an overview of, because I've gone for about an hour and 40 minutes plus here. Let me give an overview. We're going to have to have a second webinar to continue this. Let me give an overview of some things here. So our consciousness screen, when we are able to orient ourselves to that, and if we don't keep switching and jumping and changing the meanings of everything to the universe and the world out there, and we just stick within our consciousness screen, then we can think about things and say, all right, well, my consciousness screen could be other, either could be other than what it is, or it can't. Couldn't, right? Well, of course, your conscious screen could be different than it is, right? You can think about that on your own time if you want. But I don't necessarily think people will disagree. Sometimes people can kind of disagree when they're like in a tunnel vision with getting philosophical. But if you keep thinking about it, then you'll stop disagreeing and you can work through it yourself. So of course your conscious screen could be different than how it is right now. As a matter of fact, it could have been the way it was a second ago, right? Okay, so it could be something other than the way it is. It also could just not exist, right? So as far as you know, so there is either, so there has to be something capable of making consciousness screen, since there it is. So something out there, right? It's not you doing it, or you'd have to be aware of your conscious screen before you were doing it, right? You'd kind of know if you were making your own consciousness screen from scratch every second, right? So you're not doing it. So something's doing it, something that's capable of making consciousness screens. Now, there's reasons and there's causes, okay? So your consciousness screen could, for a second, like as you could contemplate, could it just happen for no reason? The way that it is, could it be configured the way it is for no reason? Now, let's try to be consistent with that and we'll find absurdity, right? One of my simple tests is like, well, what if someone punches you in the face? So to be consistent with your consciousness screen being configured the way it is any particular moment for no reason would have to mean that no reason would mean that it has no tie whatsoever to either the past or the future. That's no reason, right? So if you think someone punched you in the face, if it seems like that, it has no correlation between what actually happened a second ago or what's going to happen in the future or anything. If it could just happen for no reason. Now, can maybe some stuff come into your conscious screen for no reason and other stuff has a reason? Maybe some things happen for no reason. But again, when people talk about things happening, their mind goes to like the external world. But you don't know the external world, and your model of the external world is fake. It's fabricated. It's like the computer game. It's useful. It works within the game, but there's no such thing as the external world in the way that you think of it. It's not as real as you think. It's not as able to cause things. And it's even in your own beliefs about the external world, well, people kind of magically impose this on the external world, but the idea that it can make consciousness screens becomes a little weird. We can, I'm glossing over it. I just have to kind of keep going to keep on filling in stuff for people's understanding. again, even our concept of proof, it isn't like I give you a number of axioms that authorities say are true and they add up to God exists, nor is it about persuading you or making you feel like God exists, right? You can feel that God exists for sure without a doubt and still not know it, and you can know it and not feel it. They're two separate things. Feeling it is like a matter of how your neurons are configured. Your feelings will catch up with your knowledge over time, and you can have feelings without having knowledge. So they're kind of separate things. They're not correlated really. Even though, of course, for people they're conflated, they get confused between the two. And really, when people go for knowledge, what they're all going for is a feeling of certainty, which is just a feeling. It's a neuronal connections, which is not related. It doesn't have a one-for-one correspondence with what's true or correct, right? So they're unrelated. Or they're not perfectly correlated. Your feelings of what's true and what's actually true. If they're not perfectly correlated, they're useless. If you're playing Russian roulette and there's 5 empty parts of the chamber and 1 that's filled in, then for the most part, trigger pulls that won't kill you is correlated with what happens, right? But then 1 out of 6 times, the correlation is not there, and then that's what'll get you. So when we're able to restrict our thinking to our consciousness screen, in the sense of we're not jumping around to our old or our other view of the world, where causes happen out there in the external world, okay? Instead, we just think about our consciousness screen and think, all right, well, can things appear in my consciousness screen? Can how things seem to me? Can some of the stuff just appear for no reason? Well, if anything can happen for no reason in your consciousness screen, just in your consciousness screen, if anything can appear there for no reason, then there would have to be, you get into an absurdity again, because then there'd have to be a reason why some things happen for no reason and some things did. Basically, if anything can happen for no reason, then that boils down to you have to throw everything out. Like everything can happen for no reason. Right? Either something's deciding what happens for no reason and what doesn't, in which case everything happens for a reason because what's happening for no reason is being decided by something. That it happens for no reason, which is a reason. Or everything's just happening for no reason. So it turns out, right, as we go through that thinking, and you can go over this for yourself, and also I can continue with things, but I've already given you something you can use where you just have to check it over and work on it yourself. And you can come to understand that everything that appears in your consciousness screen has to happen for some reason. Now, you don't yet know exactly. Reason itself might be a confusing idea, but again, what it is, it's the difference only. Okay, we're building the meanings of words here from our consciousness screen. That's what you need to do to have the correct foundation for everything. You already have a meaning for words from an incorrect worldview where there's this external world that can cause things. There's objects and there's matter and light and energy, and that stuff all causes stuff, right? People will say like gravity causes such and such. Gravity can't cause anything, just like chance can't cause anything, or 3 can't cause anything. The physical laws can't cause things. They end up being regularities with which something that can actually do things does things. Just like laws of like a government, they can't cause stuff, right? Like the law doesn't put someone in jail, people do. Right? A law is like a theoretical thing or whatever, like it's a concept, but it can't do anything in and of itself. It can, as an idea in someone's mind, it can be part of what causes them to conclude something and then an action. But then again, the trouble is the word cause has a normal usage, which I just used, and then it has and then when I go into normal usage of the word cause, we end up back where we started. So it's tough at first to work through this, because we kind of keep pulling in building blocks from a place that is that's tainted. So back to our consciousness screen. As you conclude that, okay, well, there has to be some reason, and the word reason itself, we can kind of keep that in a bit of a quarantine for a second, where we need some sort of concept of reason, but we can realize that it's blurry or maybe, you know, not quite understood yet. But we can contrast it with the idea of no reason. So reason is something other than like no reason. No reason we can maybe kind of grasp, right? Like no reason whatsoever would have to, again, mean that whatever happened to you, whatever seems to happen to you, you'd have to act as if it had no correlation with anything in the future or past. So any decision making would become nonsense. You see? So trying to act and think consistently with no reason whatsoever immediately descends into absurdity. There'd be no purpose to anything, no reason to make any decision. Any decision you made would be nonsense. Like the very act of thinking that you made a decision or making a decision is nonsense, right? Because the future and the past and now are totally disconnected if there's no reason for what appears in your consciousness screen. You see that? So there has to be some sort of reason, and reason we're kind of building is just the original definition of reasons, not reason in terms of thinking, like when people talk about reason versus faith. I'm talking about reasons for things happening. I'm talking about a coherence between the past, now, and the future, right? So there has to be some sort of coherence between the past, now, and future, or everything is utterly absurd. You can't possibly live or think that way literally for a moment. So instead of even the word reason, we can talk about, you know, correlation. So there's a correlation, but then separate from this reason, with this correlation between the past, present, and future. And I get that someone in a philosophical vacuum can be, well, how do you know there's future? What is the future? You don't really have to answer the question of what is. You can ask and investigate as potentially important since they're coming up, past, present, and future, but you don't need to understand that much. You can once again look at opposites. See, in order to start seeing these concepts, instead of trying to look at the concept like future directly, you got to be like Perseus beating the Medusa. You're looking at the opposite of what it might be. So if there's no such thing as future, even if you don't really fully grasp the future, you can grasp no such thing as the future. Once again, there's no purpose or reason to anything. You can't live that way for a second. So it must be absurd. Prove it to me, right? Act as if there's no such thing as the future whatsoever. It'd be nonsense every second. There'd be no such thing as making a decision. Once again, there'd be no such thing as doing anything, no purpose to anything, not even being greater purpose, just there'd be no reason to eat. There's no reason to get pissed off if I punch you in the face, right? I don't suggest actually punching someone in the face, but it's interesting as a thought experiment to imagine someone doing the stupid sense of philosophical skepticism, and you just punch them in the face, and that resolves everything. Right? Again, I'm not actually suggesting doing that, but it's interesting to note that if you just punch them in the face, they'd have to just act like nothing happened whatsoever in order to be consistent with their kind of extreme skepticism or whatever. So anyway, there's some useful sense of past, future, and present, because without it, we'd be reduced to nonsense. So there's some consistency, which now that's reasons, okay? Again, you look at the opposite in order to try to see what the positive thing starts to be. Again, we're so used to you have to have an object for something, but what we're trying to do is be able to start to think a bit in terms of a distinction or a difference between two things. So reason is the difference of not acting as if the future doesn't exist whatsoever. Now, that then still doesn't address, well, hold on a second, so there's reasons, but something has to be capable of making the consciousness field. It would have to be making it for a reason. So there has to be something that's capable of making your consciousness field for a reason. The reason being partly whatever happened in the past, and then carrying that forward into the future with some sort of consistencies, physical laws and such, right? Again, without those consistencies, without a correlation between the past and the future, everything reverts into nonsense. So now we're looking at something has to be able to make your conscious feel, since it exists, something has to make it. You say, well, does anything have to make it? Can it just be? All right, let's maybe address that. Well, again, I'm sorry, it's kind of so absurd, but of course I can't just, act anything that I want to try to explain. It's getting created every second, right? It doesn't have to get created again. So without anything making it, it's once again appearing for no reason. Like without a creator of it, you also can't have a reason why it's there. You can't say nothing's making it, and yet there's a reason why it's there, right? So when you have reasons why when you conclude correctly that there's reasons why your conscious field is configured the way it is, rather than your conscious screen is configured the way it is, rather than some other way, then the reasons necessitate something doing it for a reason. Because if you again look at the opposite, you're looking at trying to say that nothing is making it, but for a reason, which becomes absurd. And you don't have to see it when I say it. You can take your own time with it and examine it. So we have this thing that's capable of making consciousness screens for like everyone, and is capable of doing it for a reason. And then that's where we're getting God, right? So God, and I haven't proved God. I've proved, like I'm showing you how to know that there is a thing that's capable of making consciousness screens, actually doing so, right? Making consciousness screens and making each configuration every moment based on reasons. So that's our starting point for God. And then as we explore infinite, the idea of being unlimited, can something limit God? God is not, it turns out that God is not limited. And so I'll have another webinar where I'll continue, and I'll also address even more questions and so forth. So it'll be kind of a finishing and discussing in the next webinar. I didn't get to reason versus faith, but I'll say this as a just so you have something to hold on to and think about for next time. In this, now I use the word reason again, but I'm talking about a different concept. Faith and reason are not opposed, although in practice and in usage they are. So you cannot, or should not, you cannot logically affirm something, know something via faith. You can only know something via accurate thinking, which is what I mean by reason in this context. Okay. You can know something through feeling, in which case you're not knowing it. It's not through accurate thinking, so it's irrelevant, right? So Russian roulette, right? It doesn't matter if some of the chambers are empty, some of them are going to have a bullet, and they'll kill your ability to conclude correct things about the world and God and so forth. So you're playing Russian roulette, metaphorically speaking, if you're going by feelings in terms of what you know. If you conflate the idea of knowing with a strong feeling of certainty, the absence of doubt, that's irrelevant to actual knowledge. It may happen to overlap, but since it doesn't overlap perfectly, it's irrelevant in this case. So reason would be accurate thinking, which is a method of doing that, which would lead to statements that you can affirm, like potential beliefs that you can affirm. Now, I use belief in the context of talking about stuff like this where it matters. In other contexts where we're talking about things where we don't have to be so accurate, then I can use belief in the normal colloquial way. But a belief, more accurately and strictly defined in the way I use it, is that which you act on. So with faith, actually faith and reason in the sense of accurate thinking go actually hand in hand rather than being opposed. You can't know that God exists through faith. That's a nonsense statement and very counterproductive and very poisonous, extremely poisonous, horrible. You can't know anything through faith. What faith is being consistent with what you do know. And that is extraordinarily useful, virtuous, and what Jesus would have had to be referring to. When Jesus talked about faith, it had to mean consistency with what you know. And if you look at the context in which Jesus was condemning or railing against and praising and encouraging, then it's consistent with the idea that faith in Jesus' usage or what Jesus was trying to point to something that we need to do, and that is be consistent with what we can know through some perfect method, or even with what we profess to know. And if we try to be consistent with what we profess to know, then maybe we'll either be consistent with good things, or by trying to be consistent with something we profess to know that's false, we'll find that the supposed belief or statement of truth is false. So again, just to give a quick either summary or something you can work from. Faith is the idea of being consistent with what you're acting and thinking based on something, ideally something correct and good, right? If you're faithful to something bad and evil, then that's of course just going to lead to more bad and evil. If you're consistent with true and good things, then that's great. That'll also help you break or identify and get rid of bad beliefs, right? Bad bad beliefs in the sense of things that are in your mind that you'll then act on, right? To be consistent with my saying that belief is what you act on. Or bad, I could say bad ideas if I'm trying to refer to something that you would affirm, whether or not you act on it, right? So when I use the word kind of affirm, ideally, to refer to things where we say like, yeah, I think this is true, or I know this is true, or I say this is true, right? That we don't want to ideally not use the word belief for that. We would use belief for what you act on, right? Because the idea of believing something is true is kind of irrelevant. Like you act on things, and then you can affirm what's true. So anyway, that can be those distinctions can be relevant here and there. But the profound and important idea is differentiating faith understood correctly as a useful, good concept is not opposed to reason. It actually necessarily goes hand in hand with reason. Is acting or comparing when you're thinking, and then acting on what's true and being consistent with it, such as individual property rights. If people were consistent with the idea of individual property rights, because the crazy thing is, pretty much anyone will affirm individual property rights if you in the right context, and then they're totally inconsistent with that when it comes to government policy in a way that creates horrific suffering and death and destruction throughout the world in this incredibly pervasive and horrendous way, just because people are not faithful to the idea of individual property rights. But we don't know that we have individual property rights through faith. We know it through accurate thinking, comparing with things that, and looking at the opposite and absurdity and such. And when someone says, well, you know it through faith, you need to have the gift of faith to believe in God or this, that, or the other thing. No. Yes, theists use faith very wrongly and retreat back to it, or the idea that God is unknowable whenever, they're backed into a corner. I don't do that at all. That's totally not the way to do it. Okay, so I will wrap up this webinar here. I know that to some degree people might have been expecting, okay, here's a bunch of axioms, or here's my evidence, or here this is going to make me feel a certain way. But this is the only, I don't mean that my exact progression through is the most, efficient. I always, admit and affirm that I don't know in advance or even afterwards the most efficient way to explain something in a way that keeps you listening and helps you understand, right, what I'm trying to talk about. I'm just doing my best, so to speak, in the moment, and with plenty of preparation. But however inefficiently we'll go about doing it, it's still really radically efficient and useful in relative to your life and other uses of your time to get this stuff. So, us being inefficient relative to, taking 8 hours rather than 4 hours to understand this stuff is infinitesimal in terms of spending those 8 hours doing this rather than something else. So one way or the other, I think in another webinar, we will have dealt with a topic in a certain useful way. However, I'll keep going just with the topic itself if I feel like, or getting feedback that there's still, questions basically, or unclarity. So this is kind of what I need to do with my life, given that I know how to know that God exists, then I kind of don't have much choice, so to speak, in terms of spending time explaining it to people so other people know. It's obviously important enough that I have to do it and other people don't know it. So there you go. And these are the concepts on these slides that are important, right? That will lead to it. The importance of epistemology and being willing to do what it takes. If it takes 0.01% of your life, in other words, that would be 380 hours maybe. No, that's 0.1%. 0.01% would be like 3.8 hours, I guess. Okay. This idea of logic, keeping the meanings of your words consistent. Mental objects, causes, consciousness screen. This is like a little bit relevant, or very relevant in the sense of it's a block, especially if it's a block for atheists in the sense of feeling like theists just kind of retreat back to the idea that they know through faith. It's a block for theists. People that believe in God, right? And thinking that, well, I could just know through faith. Why would I need to use something else? And then reasons and causes, and then infinite and goodness. Didn't talk about too much, but those things will kind of finish helping us understand some of the qualities of God that we can understand and finish off kind of the good news about how everything is with existence and God and us and so forth. All right, guys. Hope things work out with the whole Ukraine situation and with the potential nuclear war going on. And assuming everything's okay soon, that I will get back and we will continue with this. I'll try to announce fairly soon when the next webinar will be, I guess 2 weeks. Maybe I'll just feel feisty and want to do it though next week. So keep an eye out if you want. All right, guys, I will see you soon. Thank you for everything. Jarvis says, I can't wait to watch this replay on repeat. I appreciate that. This is so huge in my life right now. Great. I covered the basic concepts. It'll give you the building blocks. And then, I'll continue soon. Great webinar. I appreciate that. It was a great webinar. Thank you. Yeah, you were very welcome, Ashley. And I think mental objects is the perfect place to start. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Good to see with what you know. I see what I've been doing. My mind was imposing the external world in between my conscious screen or whatever it's called. Great. If you're working on this yourself, you can refer back to what Lawrence said, and it may help you. It's very good what he said. It's a good point. I thought the conscious screen change is basically not what's in it. Okay, great. Okay, great. So the little discussion here that you guys can take a look at, again, this is in the MeWe group, and it's in an event. This chat is in the event. It's not the main chat in our group, but it's in the event for this day, and you can look back at the previous chats from the events. I believe you can access them even if you weren't in the event previously, but also they're on my screen now if you want to take a look. So it's all here. They scroll through. Excellent, guys. Take care, and I will see you soon.